Hello, and welcome to the series on reimagining the Latinx experience in America. We are very excited today to have with us Geraldo Cadava, who is the author of The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, which will be the subject of our discussion today. And we are also joined by Cecilia Muñoz, who is going to be offering commentary on the book. Now, I first want to begin by acknowledging some of the people who've made this event possible. First of all, we wouldn't be able to operate without the support of UC Irvine School of Law and the American Bar Foundation. So I wanted to thank Dean Austin Parrish at the law school and Interim Director Bryant Garth at the foundation for their support. I also want to thank Robbie Kadri and Colleen Tarakani for their work in supporting this event through publicity and technology support, and we're very grateful for their efforts. Finally, none of this would be possible without my research assistant, Elizabeth Schatz-Cordero, who is a student here and helps me identify authors and put together our time and list, and so she's just been wonderful. And today, we're going to begin with commentary from Professor Cadava, and then we'll have response and questions from Cecilia Muñoz. And then if you have questions, you should feel free to use the question and answer function. And then Elizabeth will monitor that to be sure that your questions are addressed to the extent that we have time. Now, let me just briefly introduce our two speakers today. The first, as I mentioned, is Professor Geraldo Cadava, and he teaches history at Northwestern University, and he also directs a program there in Latina and Latino studies. He, in addition to his book on the Hispanic Republican, previously published a book called Standing on Common Ground, The Making of the Sun Belt Borderland, which received the 2014 Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians, and it was also named Book of the Year by Australian Book Review. The Hispanic Republican was named by NBC News as one of the 12 best Latino books of 2020, and Professor Cadava is currently at work on another book called Out of One Many, A Latino History of the United States. He's also continued to do his work on Latino politics in a book chapter on Latinos for Trump, which is part of an anthology on the presidency of Donald J. Trump. Now I wanted to introduce Cecilia Muñoz, and she is a national leader in public policy and public interest technology, currently serves as a senior advisor to New America. She has nearly 3 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector, and that includes, she also had 8 years of service on President Obama's senior team. She began as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs and then served as Director of the Domestic Policy Council. Before that, she spent 20 years at the National Council of La Raza. She was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship in 2000 for her work on immigration and civil rights, and is a trustee of the Kresge, MacArthur, and Joyce Foundations. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that she will be talking about her own book, More Than Ready, Be Strong and Be You, and other lessons for women of color on the rise in this very book talk series on November 2nd at 12 noon Pacific time. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cadava and Cecilia Muñoz for this presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction, Professor Moran, and thank you everyone at UCI and the wider law school community and beyond for participating and helping to pull this series together. I think it's a great series and a great idea. I think this is a really important series of conversations to be having. And thank you also, Cecilia, for taking the time to read my book a couple of years ago and engage in conversation with it about it now. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with you. And I want to just dive right into the questions because we're going to cover a lot of what's in the book and the broader themes that it raises and how the themes of the book intersect with this, what feels like a pressing conversation now about shifts among Latino voters. I'm not going to talk about those things in the first few minutes. I'm just going to, kind of tell a story, I think, about 2020 and its aftermath, and how the conversation about Latinos has evolved over the past couple of years. And I think what I'll say very much intersects with the themes of the book as well, but also just is a kind of overview of the moment I think that we're in now. So the first thing I'll say is that I think that the Donald Trump administration entered 2020 feeling pretty good about where they were at with Latinos, but not only. They were some of his Latino surrogates, he himself, Vice President Mike Pence, some of Mike Pence's relatives were traveling around to Latino communities to visit evangelical churches or to talk to groups of small business owners like the Latino Coalition, which is technically a nonpartisan organization, but most of its members are certainly skew Republican. But Donald Trump or Mike Pence spoke at the gathering of their annual conference every year that Trump was in office. And I attended the meeting in 2019 as a kind of fly on the wall, or as a historian, since I was writing a book about it. And I learned a lot about how they saw their appeal to Latinos. And that appeal very much carried into 2020 when they were talking about things like defending religious liberty. And that's not just about church, but it's also about school choice and charter schools that have religious identifications and things like that. And they were also talking about all of the economic accomplishments of their administration. Latino families had higher rates of family income on average, higher rates of home ownership, lower rates of unemployment. They very much did not talk about how that trend line had started to pick up during the Obama years and was more a kind of comeback from the 2008 crash, the financial decline then, than it was the result of anything the Trump administration had done, yet they nevertheless took credit for that. So they were going into 2020 making wild predictions about how they were going to win the Latino vote. They were going to win half of all Latino votes. This was the second time they had said this. I don't know if you guys remember, but in 2015, I think, Trump started his campaign talking not just about Mexican rapists, immigrants, murderers, but also about how he is going to win the Latino vote. Then he went to give a speech in Detroit about how he was going to do better than any other Republican before him among African Americans. And so this was kind of how they entered and saw what they were going to try to do with voters of color. We can unpack all of this for sure. Then COVID happened. And I think COVID really, in some ways, swept the rug from underneath their feet and put them in a more difficult position, not just because daily we were seeing all of the ways in which frontline workers were in a very difficult position, but people were losing their jobs. It kind of, I think, took away the economic argument. And then in the spring of 2020, in the summer of 2020, the argument of the campaign really started refocusing on these social division issues and Antifa and the overreach of protesters. And in some ways that felt very familiar to me as someone who has studied the civil rights movement, how the right lashed back against all of the liberal civil rights protests of the 1960s. Some of that felt very familiar to me. Another thing that happened in the summer of 2020, I don't know if you guys remember this, but there was this kind of infamous gathering at the White House Rose Garden where the CEO of Goya Beans got up and gave a speech about, all of the speakers really, they were kind of talking about their up by the bootstraps experience, how they didn't have shoes when they were children, but now they became, the corporate titans and the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And yes, the CEO of Goya Beans made some comment about how lucky we were to have Donald Trump as president, which incited this huge backlash. And there was, all sorts of boycott Goya Beans activism going on for a period in the summer of 2020. What I find really interesting about that gathering is what that gathering was actually about was about the Trump administration announcing new initiatives that were like investments in Hispanic serving institutions and all of the small business loans that the administration was creating. So I thought it's telling that the media and Latino organizations got carried away with the boycott Goya beans movement at the same time that they weren't really paying attention to what that event was actually about as part of the appeal of the Trump administration. I think that's indicative actually of how in many ways the Trump presidency was this kind of split screen reality when it came to Latinos. And on one side of the screen were all of these kind of vile public pronouncements about Mexican immigrants, but at the other side of the screen, there was, call it what you want, but something that looked like a sincere effort to, throughout his years in office, reach out to Latino voters by appealing to religious conservatives, business owners, those who supported school choice, things like that. So I think that was indicative. And then, the fall kind of kicked into normal campaign season where, there were critiques of Democrats for doing too little, too late, the Democratic theory of doing all the get out the vote operation in the weeks between the big party national conventions and then the election. It's kind of a sprint of voter outreach. And the critique of Democrats and Republicans at many times has often been like, well, it's too little, too late. Latinos have always been asking for a more constant engagement with our community, even when you're not looking for our votes, things like that. I skipped right over the conventions themselves, but I don't know if you guys watched or if you remember the 2020 political conventions, but the Republican one was like high theater. You had the pardoning of a criminal on live TV, and you had Herschel Walker and Tim Scott. And for my interests, I mean, there were the crowd shots featuring members of the National Border Patrol Union that was endorsing Donald Trump. So, there again was the split screen reality of all of the ways in which Donald Trump was actually trying to reach out to voters of color. So then the election happens, and we start to see returns in Florida and Texas, and the margins exceed what was expected in Florida. They way exceed what happened in South Texas, and even on election night, people were kind of suspecting that something was going on. I was on the Daily Show with Trevor Noah the day after the election, because of how the thing I had written about was in the news. These are the kinds of things that authors hope for, but if it weren't for like the kind of crashing of the news that one day as it intersected with the topic I'd written about, I mean, that wouldn't have happened. And then it was just this crazy kind of media blitz for about a month after the election, just with people expressing their shock and surprise about how Latinos had voted. And so during that period, a couple weeks after the election, I remember having a lot of conversations with editors I'd worked with friends in the field about like, oh, this is a really interesting moment. Maybe there will be like new conversations that result from this election about who Latinos are. And so, I was talking to friends about what we needed to do over the next few years to kind of have the biggest possible conversations that we could have about Latinos. And it's been a little bit frustrating, actually, to see that not really pan out, because here we are in the months before a midterm, and we're just asking the same questions. Is the shift real? Is it long lasting? Was it an aberration because of COVID and the uniqueness of a character like Donald Trump? So we're again only engaging this conversation about who are Latinos as voters. Are they going to be Democrats? Are they going to be Republicans? On the one hand, compared with, the summer of 2020, I do think that people are paying attention to Latino conservatism in a way that they hadn't before. They're still debating it a lot, but I think even in the summer of 2020, I don't think it was really taken seriously as a conversation, this kind of looming idea that there was a real shift taking place among Latinos. So on the one hand, yes, I guess it's good that we're having that conversation, but it still feels to me like we're stuck in this moment of, are they Democrats? Are they Republicans? And I say that because these are the questions I'm still getting asked by reporters who want to talk to me. What are your predictions for what's going to happen in November? How are Republicans going to do? And way where the vote, there was the governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia that were kind of like proxies between the 2020 election and the 2022 midterms that would give us some sign of how Latinos were going to vote. Then there was the recall of Gavin Newsom in California. Well, how did Latinos vote in that? Is that sort of some sort of proxy for how Latinos are going to vote in 2020? So, I think that's where we are right now. I don't know that I would love to hear some of Cecilia's thoughts about this. I don't know that Democrats have still learned the right lessons from 2020. I'm not sure. I know that, I remember reading, Cecilia, an article you wrote in The Atlantic shortly after the inauguration that was kind of like simultaneous frustration with immigrant rights activists for their kind of overblown expectations. But also, I think what a lot of the Biden administration's efforts early on to roll back as much as they could of Trump's immigration policies was based on this idea that, like, okay, well, if we need, in order to get Latinos back into our camp, we need to start acting soon on immigration. That's an important lesson, and it has to do with the frustrations that Latinos have felt for decades about the failure to act on immigration promises. But I don't think it's the only lesson to learn about what was bringing Latinos into the Republican Party. So just to begin the conversation, this is kind of like my overview of the past couple of years, what has happened, and this also kind of intersects with the life of the book, which came out in May 2020, and so yeah, I'm excited to talk about any of this stuff or anything else on your mind, Cecilia.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. This couldn't be better timing for this conversation. And honestly, it couldn't be better timing for your book, really. Right? That this is a conversation that in part because of the election of 2020, but I think in general,
Yeah.
That some level the media has been ready to have, the country has been ready to have. I have to say, I get very frustrated, as it sounds like you do too, about kind of the coverage of our presence in the electorate. First of all, because it's frequently the only coverage of our presence in the country.
Totally. Yeah.
But also because, like I saw in one of the many newsletters that find their way to my inbox, this one from the New York Times just last week, the headline was Latinos, who are newly swing voters. And, I've been working in this arena for a long time. You know more about it than just about anybody. We're not new swing voters. I mean, what your book does is demonstrate the long history of Republicans courting Latinos and succeeding in at least getting 30%. Right?
Yeah.
And in order to win the presidency, and in many states, in order to win statewide, Republicans don't need the majority of the Latino vote. They need 40-ish%.
Yeah.
And they regularly get 30. And what your book does is provide a history of why that is. But I'd love to know, I mean, maybe you did, predict the timeliness of this moment.
No.
But going back to when you started up with this book was the work of many years.
Yeah.
What prompted you to write it in the first place?
Yeah, two things. And thanks for asking that. I mean, I think the important thing to note is that I am not someone who, I've been interested in partisan politics. I think the American political system is fascinating. I think it's infinitely complicated, and it becomes even more so the more the country grows and the more diverse it grows. So yes, I've been interested in electoral politics, but I think what prompted me to write this book was two things that didn't have much to do with electoral politics at all. One was my relationship with my Republican grandfather, who voted for Ronald Reagan for the first time in 1980 because he supported Reagan's tax cuts. He was a copper miner in Arizona at the time, and he was talking about how Reagan was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paychecks. But then over the next 40 years into the present, he's become a kind of dyed-in-the-wool Republican, a Republican loyalist, to the extent that in 2016, he told me that he liked Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a good guy because he was a Republican. It wasn't attached to any kind of policy preferences or anything. It was just he liked Donald Trump, who was a good guy because he was a Republican. So part of what I was interested in is just this evolution of how Latino Republicans become committed party loyalists, even as it seemed to me, the party was not really representing their interests. That was my understanding of it. So in some ways, I think the book is a kind of ongoing argument with my grandfather about, I've always wanted to understand him, but I also always wanted to understand the wider world that he was a part of. And I should say that despite his like conservatism, he is in no way a party man. I mean, he was not a member of like, well, I mean, in the sense of joining organizations and stuff like that. He wasn't a member of the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. He voted in every election, but he wasn't a delegate or anything like that. He didn't belong to any political clubs, nothing like that. So he just was who he was and believed what he believed. So he's one reason. And then the second reason is in my first book, Standing on Common Ground, I wrote about a Mexican-American department store owner named Alex Jacome, who owned a department store in Tucson called Jacome's Department Store. And he really saw his department store as his own little mission. And he saw himself as like the big man, the patron, the don at the head of his mission. He was good friends with Barry Goldwater. He hated Cesar Chavez, who was like a self-aggrandizing Marxist and was only interested in his own power rather than representing his members of the UFW. And he opposed any kind of minimum wage. He didn't think his employers needed to unionize because, of course, he, as the head of his department store, was going to take care of all of his employees and make sure that their needs were met. So he was someone like this conservative Mexican-American during the Cold War, 50s, 60s, 70s, who I just hadn't encountered in an archive before. You know, I mean, in my mind, to the extent that we knew anything about Latino conservatives, it was about the Cuban exile community in South Florida. And here was this Mexican-American department store owner who just defied a lot of what I thought I knew about Mexican Americans. So I just wanted to understand the wider world that he was a part of. There had to be more than him. So those are some of the threads I started to pull on early on. And the last thing that I can say in 1 second is just that I didn't approach this in order to figure out whether Latinos were Republicans or Democrats. I just see conservatism as an underexplored aspect in the literature, the scholarly literature of who Latinos are. And that's an important point to make, I think, because I'm not like a political consultant trying to figure out how to get my candidate to 51% or something like that. I'm just trying to explain the Latino community in its broadest possible sense.
Right, right. So let me invite, I see that there's a question in the Q&A. Let me just invite everybody, if you to put questions in the Q&A. I'm going to keep asking mine, and I'll just kind of decide when to turn to yours based on how many there are. So feel free to put questions in. Geraldo, if you could, I mean, based on what you learned in the process of writing the book, if you had, could distill 2 or 3 nuggets of like what you most wish people understood about the history. I mean, your book goes back to Barry Goldwater, it goes back to Eisenhower.
Yeah.
You know, the Nixon administration makes a strong appearance. Like, this has been a conversation Republican leaders have been having with the Latino community for a long time. What are the 2 or 3 nuggets you most wish people knew?
Man, okay. Let's see. So one I think is just that, yeah, you know, as a historian, I can tell you that the Republican candidate has won between 1/4 and 1/3 of the vote in every single presidential election since 1972. 1976 with Ford, 1996 with Dole. Those were outliers. They got lower than that quarter. George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, in at least 84, I also think 1980, they got a little higher than that third kind of high end of Latino support for Republicans. And so, but for the most part, it's kind of astounding that support for the Republican Party has been pretty consistent despite the radical changes within the Republican Party. You know, the Republican Party of today is very different than the Republican Party of the Nixon years or the Reagan years or the Bush years. So I think that consistency is something to be both appreciated so that we don't kind of have an overblown reaction to Republican support among Latinos. But it also, like, thinking about the differences, like why is that support so consistent across time, even as the party changes a lot? That's another kind of puzzle to figure out. So the steadiness is one thing. I would also, I think one thing also that was interesting to me about the aftermath of 2020 is like, of course, first we were like, oh, this is happening in South Florida. Oh, this is happening in South Texas. But then I remember there was some great like data visualization by the New York Times, this guy Ford Fessenden, and I can't remember who his co-author was, but they showed this shift all over the country in places like California, Philadelphia, Cook County, Illinois, New York, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It happened everywhere. Carlos Odio at Equis Research calls it a kind of baseline shift. It happened all across the country. And that is a surprising fact for a lot of different reasons. I mean, one, when this is just a product of our electoral system, I think, where elections, for better and worse, probably for worse, are decided by just a handful of states. And so candidates kind of prioritize those states like Texas, Florida, Arizona, and their understanding of the Latino community writ large is kind of determined by their understanding of the Latino community in these important battleground states. And I think it's important going forward to understand that Latinos are important swing voters everywhere across the country that they live. I don't think campaigns go to Wisconsin and say that they're going to talk to the dairy farmers of Wisconsin and assume that they are also talking to Latinos, or that they go to Michigan and talk to the, working class car makers and realize that they are also talking to Latinos, So I think the other thing is just really expanding our map of who we think Latinos are, where they think they are. I don't address that as much in the book as I could, but I think that's an important conversation that we need to have about Latinos.
100%.
Yeah.
So one sort of through line that I found really interesting, right? That when you talk about sort of the early days, the early administrations, early Republican administrations kind of trying to figure us out. One way to do that, which is still true, is through representation, is to hire somebody.
Yeah.
And that was a focus for those administrations. It was very much a focus for the activists, right? And I'm kind of a policy nerd, so I'm really interested in, what is the policy conversation that any political party should be having with the community? Like, what is it? Do we see ourselves represented there? Is one question. And then the second question is, do we hear the candidate, the elected official, talking to us about stuff that we care about? How would you, how important is representation, and has that been in your view as opposed to policy? And who's been good at one or the other?
Yeah. You guys, everyone listening, I had the benefit of previewing some of these questions, and I've really sat with this one, and I love it so much because in some ways, like my thinking over the past couple of years has moved more in the direction of policy and caring more about policy, because I really think, I just think that this is what I believe. In order for parties to have success among Latinos, they actually need to convince Latinos that they are representing their interests. And that means more listening to what Latinos are telling you they actually care about. And that sounds obvious, of course, but there is a lot of conversation among campaigns and consultants about just talking to Latinos, just outreach, just knocking on doors. And that's all you have to do. Just go have the conversations. And, I just read an article about Ruben Gallego a couple of days ago, and his whole idea is that the Democrats, we need to be a party that fights. We need to be more pugnacious. We need to get into the ring and have fights. Like, yeah, I know that in order to win, we've let Republicans, run all over us and not stand up for what we believe in. So yes, we need to fight, but I also think there needs to be a clear articulation of like what we're fighting for, what we stand for, how we're going to make your lives better, And so recently I have, in my own thinking, I would place an emphasis on policy instead of just outreach, mobilize. This also relates to this broader conversation about like mobilization versus persuasion. Are you just trying to mobilize the people who already agree with you? Or are you actually trying to persuade them of how your policies are better than the other person's? So I think that's how I see things today. But I think the parties, yes, I'm sure there are certain candidates who've done better than others. I think, this is my anecdotal observation. I think the candidates who have done better at this are the ones who've been able to claim some sort of connection with the Latino community before they run for office. So that's where Republicans like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were successful. They were representatives of California, the governor of California. Reagan talked about appointing more Mexican Americans to his administration than any California governor since the 19th century. He knew the interests of Mexican Americans. Even Hillary Clinton talked about like campaigning for McGovern in the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, it's not a deep connection based on a long history, but it's something that she could point to in her past. Obama was an organizer or something like that. So I think those candidates have been more successful than those who don't have a kind of natural connection with Latinos and understand something about Latino communities. But take someone like Nixon, for example. I mean, where his politics of like representation and where his policy positions ended, I think there's some overlap there. I mean, yes, he appointed the first U.S. Treasurer of the United States, Romana Acosta Bañuelos. That appointment, he wanted to find someone who would be representative of the Latino conservative community. She was a business owner. She created fellowships for Mexican American students at UCLA, but they were certainly not Chicanos. She did not support the Chicano movement. She was a feminist in the sense that she started a bank. She was a businesswoman, started Ramona's Mexican food produce production. I can't remember. It's the largest like Mexican food distributor in the Southwest, still exists today. So she was a great model, a kind of representative for a lot of the Nixon administration's values. But then he also did things like create the National Economic Development Agency headed by a guy named Ben Fernandez. Actually, this guy right here, Ben Fernandez for president. It's a 1980 campaign poster. He was the first Mexican American, first Hispanic to run for president as a Republican. He, during the Nixon administration, headed the National Economic Development Association, which was about helping Latinos and other people of color start banks, saving banks, thrift banks. And for him, he had this whole idea about brown capitalism and Black capitalism. And so it was an underappreciated plank of the civil rights movement that didn't get as much attention as the protests in the streets. But his idea was that economic uplift was every bit as important as all of those other civil rights era movements. And so, I think policies of economic uplift, these policies kind of intersect with the issues of representation. And I think of course they have to do both. I don't think if you do only policy without the representation stuff, then maybe Latino communities won't always be clear on how certain policies are benefiting their communities. I mean, I do think communities also need spokespeople, but I think that the representation and policy part kind of goes hand in hand. And I think that, I think it's probably true, unfortunately, that both parties have been guilty of, thinking about how to fit Latinos into their own policy interests instead of starting by listening to Latinos tell them about their policy interests, I think.
Right. So you mentioned civil rights just now, and I was kind of fascinated in reading your book about the kind of tensions in sort of the Goldwater to Nixon era around civil rights as opposed to other values, right? That Goldwater was pretty hostile to traditional civil rights as they were expressed at the time, but really saw commonalities. I mean, he was from Arizona. He was not unfamiliar with the community and saw kind of the patriotism, entrepreneurship angle, right, as the angle. But what you recount in the book is that, in the community, those values, all of those values were strong, right? Entrepreneurship and patriotism, but also civil rights.
Yeah.
Did that tension was it just destined to be a tension on the Republican side, or did the fact that we didn't let go of those values exert a little bit of a pull?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting the question. And I think it relates to the last thing we were just talking about, like issues of representation versus policy, because I do think, you know, there is one way of looking at Latino engagement with the Republican Party and thinking that Latinos, or thinking that the Republican Party hasn't always known what to do with Latinos, because on the one hand, they do potentially, you know, disrupt some of what they want to do politically at the same time that they very much are representatives of conservatism. So, you know, you have these tensions between ideas that, you know, stated by people like Ronald Reagan, that Latinos are natural conservatives and that they're going to naturally be drawn to the Republican Party, compared with, you know, the increasingly rightward trends on immigration and a lot of issues. So I think there is a long history to be told there about the ways in which Latino conservatives both are drawn to the Republican Party, but also have a relationship with it that they have to negotiate very carefully. Because I think deep down, they know that, like, the Republican Party's race problem is something that needs to be dealt with in order for them to feel like they have a real home in the Republican Party. And I think that did stretch back to the 1960s. I mean, I think one interesting thing about, you know, the Goldwater Nixon era is that this was a moment when the Republican Party knew that it was losing support from African Americans who were abandoning the Republican Party because of its opposition to civil rights. And the Nixon campaign was very explicit about the need to recruit Latinos in order to make up for that lost support among African Americans. And what that suggests, there's also this long history of the Republican Party using, you know, civil rights and economic issues, schooling, whatever, as a wedge between, to drive a wedge between the Latino and Black communities. And so there's always been this argument since the 60s forward about, like, oh, Latinos, you know, you should be Republicans because we stand for your interests, but the Democratic Party is the party that represents the interests of Black people. And you see that over and over again in busing, for example. I mean, Reagan, when he was the governor of California, really used busing as an issue because, of course, busing was important for African Americans because it led to it was part of the desegregation of their schools. For Latinos who wanted to continue to send their children to neighborhood schools with bilingual teachers, they didn't want to bus their kids. So, you know, Republicans have used lots of these issues as a way of driving a wedge between Latinos and African Americans. And that's interesting because, you know, that is certainly a version of identity politics, even though the Republican Party likes to tell itself that it's not the party of identity politics. It's the party of patriotic Americanism, regardless of race, color, and creed or something. But they've definitely played identity politics.
So I have to jump on that one with a question that I didn't send you in advance, just because I that just really resonates very deeply. And I have often thought that the political class in general, and this is true of I think is true of Democrats as it is of Republicans, and it's certainly true in the media, is having trouble escaping the paradigm of kind of minority voters, which has been set, really the understanding of minority voters has been set by the African American community. And so right now, African American voters tend to vote very heavily for Democrats, not 100%, but just about as close as any community gets. And so that's kind of the paradigm.
Yeah.
At one point when I was working at what was then called the National Council of La Raza, it's now Unidos US.
Yeah.
I was responsible for immigration policy, which at least back in those days had some bipartisan participation, and I made the rounds of conservative and Republican organizations and leaders, and there were very clearly two schools of thought. School of thought number one was Latino voters are just like African American voters, and they're in the tank for the Democrats, so forget about it. And the other school of thought, which I think of as the Reagan school of thought, is, wow, Latino voters are hardworking, conservative social values, strong faith, either Catholics or evangelicals. Like, these are perfect Republicans. We just haven't been talking to them.
Yeah.
Like, and right, those are the kind of the two schools of thought.
Totally.
Does that ring true to you in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, I know another one of your questions was this moment that we're in now, my book kind of it really ends with Bush. I mean, yes, because it came out right around the time of the election, I did have the opportunity to like rewrite the intro and conclusion to say some things about the results of the 2020 election. But the substance of it ends with Bush, and then, the stuff about Trump is more speculative. But I think we're in this really interesting moment right now where I thought and this is what I've had Republicans tell me, Republicans who worked in the George W. Bush administration. And, they have now called the Bush administration Republican light, because the Bush administration was kowtowing to this democratic idea that the way to reach out to Latinos was by passing comprehensive immigration reform. And that underwrote George Bush's popularity in a lot of ways with, working with Vicente Fox on an immigration reform bill, those kinds of things. And what they now say they love about Donald Trump, they compare him more to Ronald Reagan than to George W. Bush, because forgetting all the stuff about how Reagan was different about the border, we didn't need a fence, Mexico was an ally, those kinds of things. So they forget those comparisons. But what they say about Reagan is that he was a true ideological conservative, and Trump is a true ideological conservative. Now, we know that there are problems with that, but that was the idea, that Trump had principles, he stood for them, and he was like a magnet that brought Latinos to him because he was standing for ideological conservatism. He wasn't trying to kowtow to Democrats. And that's a kind of an old idea. Like, Republicans have said for a long time, like, we win when we represent our conservative values. That's when we win. We don't win when we try to forge a more moderate path, a path of compromise, things like that. So it's an old idea, but I really do hear Hispanic Republicans talking about it today as a justification for why they like Donald Trump. And that's what's interesting to me about that too, is that it shows something about how Latino conservatives at each moment have also moved with the party. And I think in 2016, a lot of the people I had talked to, and this is just interesting anecdotally, but oh man, I'm so sorry. I'm going too long because I know we got to get to questions, but I find these things so interesting that, like, I might have forgotten what I was going to say because I got concerned about time.
Let me jump in and I mean, you're right that there are many problems with the analysis that with respect to Trump and Reagan hewing to conservative values, but among the many things that argument forgets is that Ronald Reagan is the guy who signed IRCA, the bill that legalized documented immigrants.
Yes.
Right, which is as an anti-Trump a thing as you can imagine. So, and we haven't talked a lot about immigration, and it's not one of the things that I was planning to ask you about, because in part because of what the theme of my question is, immigration tends to suck up all the oxygen, and that I have long complained that Democrats have frequently thought all I have to do is say the right stuff on immigration, and then I can check the Latino box, and then I'm done. And that is patently not so. But it is also true that our advocates are pretty loud on the immigration topic, and so they're right. It doesn't come out of nowhere. So immigration does suck up a fair amount of oxygen, but your book uncovers a range of things that folks care about. Like, what's your sense of how that issue has played on the Republican side?
The issue of immigration? Yeah. I mean, I think that, oh boy, there are so many interesting things to say about this, but just take the Bracero program, for example. This was a managed labor migration program that lasted from 1942 to 1964, supposed to be a wartime measure to kind of replace American laborers who had gone off to fight in the war, but it lasted well beyond the war because employers really grew used to having a steady supply of cheap labor. And it was actually Democrats who opposed the Bracero program in the 1960s because it was a kind of like anti-labor measure, because people like Cesar Chavez opposed the Bracero program because most of his constituents in the United Farm Workers were Mexican-American workers, and for them, Mexican immigrants were a threat. And it was the Republican Party at that moment that supported the Bracero program because their constituents were growers and factory owners and railroad magnates who needed a supply of cheap laborers. And so that's just an example of how, like, party identities on immigration, like so many issues, have scrambled over time. I mean, I think the Republican Party for a long time, I would say into the early 1990s, at least the party leaders supported immigration reform and an immigration deal. Yes, they emphasized things like border security, but they were willing to go along with a pathway to citizenship, as we call it now. There were kind of insurgent forces that started creeping up in the late 1970s with like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, John Tanton, Pat Buchanan, and then by 1992, when Buchanan poses a serious primary challenge to George H.W. Bush, because he won, I think, like 37% of all primary voters in 1992, he was able to shape the Republican Party platform a little bit. And so he included in the 1992 Republican Party platform the construction of structures along the border. And it sparked this whole debate among Latino conservatives about whether Pat Buchanan was actually calling for the construction of a border wall. And then from the 1990s forward, I think the Republican Party has kind of really basically doubled down on anti-immigrant restrictions. I mean, I think in some ways, George W. Bush was an 8-year aberration, but even his thinking had changed by 9/11, you know, because the whole country just went in this anti-immigrant direction ever since. And I think I'd love to be proven wrong about this, but I think that we just are, as a nation, a kind of in this moment, a fairly anti-immigrant nation at the moment. I mean,
yeah, the bottom certainly fell out after the George W. Bush years. There's no question.
It did. I mean, you had Herman Cain calling for an electrified fence. You had Mitt Romney calling for self-deportation, things like that. And I also think, you know, I don't. This is just a feeling. I think that, you know, during the pandemic, when we've all felt insecure in lots of different directions, I mean, job insecurity, health insecurity, or whatever, I think when our own internal sense of insecurity is heightened, I don't know if it's just a kind of natural human response to feel like we don't have the bandwidth to take on the concerns of other people who are not part of the United States or something. But I think that Republicans today are pretty easily able to exploit that insecurity we feel and turn it against immigrants.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, Elizabeth, we have a couple of questions from our participants. Let me turn to you to ask them.
Yes, thank you. This first question was asked earlier when you were sharing your observations about the Biden administration reversing Trump's immigration policies, and how that's one lesson to learn, but not the only one. And the question was, I'm curious what the right lessons to learn from and what are the better questions?
Well, so just what I meant by that as an example, and I think Cecilia is better than anyone else to talk about, you know, the thinking within the Democratic Party about what the best way to reach Latinos is right now. But I think that, you know, there are certain issues that, like school choice, I think is a good one. I mean, school choice is pretty widely popular among Latino families because you can kind of empathize with the idea that public schools in their neighborhoods have not always served them well. They've looked for alternatives to their traditional public schools because they feel underserved by the public school system. And so, you know, some of the fastest growing charter school networks are in places like Southern California, Florida, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. You know, I mean, these are places where school choice has been really important. And I think what's interesting about, instead of like segregating all these issues like school choice or like religious liberty or like socialism, I mean, I see these things as all deeply connected, because part of what school choice is about is the ability to have a religious network like Cristo Rey really introduce religion into schools. It's about, you know, being able to wear their uniforms to schools. It's also about teaching anti-communism, because communism is a godless religion, you know, or it's a godless philosophy. That's the idea. And so all these things are deeply interconnected. But I do think that, you know, Democrats, I don't know if Democrats have sufficiently like taken on board this idea that there are legitimate policy positions on charter schools, for example, that draw Latinos to the Republican Party. Now, Democrats don't have to respond. They don't have to say like, oh, well, all of a sudden we'll start supporting charter schools. But I do think that Democrats need to at least acknowledge that there are those issues that are vulnerabilities, areas of vulnerability for them. I think so. Charter schools is one issue. You know, I think like, you know, even like military service and border patrol employment, these are all things that have been really important within Latino communities. I mean, I kind of think about my grandpa again here, who served in the Air Force for a long time. And, you know, he would consider himself to be a true American patriot. His military service has been a really important defining characteristic of his life. You know, he doesn't believe that the United States is an evil empire wreaking havoc around the world. He believes that the United States is a defender of liberty and freedom around the world. Now, we can disagree with that and argue with it, but it's a sincere belief that he holds. And so I think that's what I was talking about. These are the kinds of like issues that the Democratic Party can wrestle with when they think about what matters to Latinos. I mean, Cecilia, feel free to jump in on some of this stuff. I don't know.
I may. I want to make sure Elizabeth gets to ask the next question, and then I may.
I'll be brief.
Yeah. The next question is just asking if you could talk about any evidence you see of anti-Blackness in the story of Latinx conservatism.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. I also see some evidence of like, I see some evidence of the exclusion of Afro-Latinos from the story of Blackness in the United States as well. I mean, look at the 1619 Project, which is all about the kind of Middle Passage and slavery in the United States and all of its legacies for the United States. That book has nothing to say about Black Latinos. And so reading that book, how would Black Latinos possibly feel included in the experience of African-American history either? So, but yes, there's absolutely, I mean, I think there were those instances I pointed to of the Republican Party driving a wedge between Blacks and Latinos. But the truth is they were able to do that, not necessarily because of some nefarious plot by the Republican Party, but because Latinos were open to having that wedge driven between them and Black communities. And I think also here in Chicago, after the George Floyd protests, I mean, there were news stories about Puerto Ricans beating up Black looters and rioters here in the streets of Chicago in 2020. And so I absolutely think that exists. I think that I can tell you that in the world of academia that there is a lot of effort to kind of correct for that historical inattention to Afro-Latino communities. I mean, there are so many of the dissertations I'm supervising now are either about Black-Brown coalitions or you know, histories of Afro-Latinos or histories of anti-Blackness. Maybe you guys know this book by Tanya Kateri Hernandez that just came out called Racial Innocence. I think she might be a law professor, so maybe it's even, I can get points for like knowing something about the legal literature about these things. But yes, I definitely think it's real.
Gosh, we have 5 minutes and there's so many more things that we could talk about. But I think I'll go back to, I was on the phone with a political reporter this morning who was asking me about the kind of our newfound tilt toward Republicans. And I sort of had to explain that it's not a new thing. If you had a room full, let's assume that this Zoom call were full of political reporters who are thinking about us because there's an election coming up and we're voters and they're kind of fascinated by this notion that some of us voted for Donald Trump. Like, what do they most need to know?
So much, Cecilia, so much. But I think like part of it is, I think you're right that something you said at the very beginning about how the only time our communities get reported about is in the context of elections. I mean, sometimes what I really want, I just want stories about who we are on a day-to-day basis. What, you know, tell me about like Latino homeownership. Let's see stories about that. Let's see stories about, gosh, I don't know, Latino students year round and all of the challenges and opportunities we face in public schools and elementary school and high school, instead of just at election time, how we're going to vote. I also want stories. I mean, I think that like our history is really important as a way of explaining our politics. So for me, like, let's read stories about Puerto Rico's territorial status, and not just independence and decolonization, but those who really fight for statehood and have for a long time. Like, what's the real statehood argument? How is that a product of our history over 100 years? And how has that history over the past 100 years shape how we see politics? So I would just love to see, and this is why I don't know if it's appealing. I don't know if it's a sexy thing to say to a lot of press corps journalists, but I just want like regular stories about Latinos just doing regular things all the time instead of how we vote. I would also say that like I do think there's this obsession with particular issues, like how we feel about abortion, how we feel about healthcare, how we feel about immigration. I think, fine, that's part of learning what Latinos care about. But the thing I worry about is that by focusing on these individual issues, it's almost as though reporters want us to tell them like what the secret is so that they could like unlock this secret with a key if they understand that it's all about immigration or it's all about healthcare. And then once they understand, they can put us back in a box and put us on the shelf because they understand us. And I just think that political behavior, people's senses of themselves, it's much more complicated than focusing on these particular issues.
Indeed.
That, I think there's this conversation though that has emerged, like, yes, we're willing to recognize your full complexity, but then the simple explanation becomes like, oh, well, it's just because Latinos are becoming just like the Irish or the Germans were 100 years ago. And that to me, I don't know, all that to me means that we're assimilating in some fashion, but I think that what assimilation means today is so different than what it meant 100 years ago. And the America that we are assimilating into is a much different America than it was 100 years ago. And so the only way they can understand that conversation, though, is by referring to these European ethnic groups that became white. And I don't know that Latino assimilation today means becoming white.
Well, it's part of the same problem of putting us in the box of some other community that they understand better, right? So we don't quite fit the African American paradigm, but we are also not Irish and Italian.
No.
We are our own thing.
Yeah.
And quite a complex one, and one that happens to be the largest minority group in the country. So it is worth figuring out who we are, not just because we vote, but because we're a big chunk of the country.
We're 60 million Americans. Yes, that's right.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you so
Listen,
much.
Oh, I just wanted to briefly close and thank both of you, Professor Cadava, Cecilia Munoz. I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation, but I also just wanted to mention, because it's ironic, our upcoming book talks deal with some of the issues that you raised. And so our next one on October 19th looks at Afro-Latinos in the U.S. economy with Michelle Holder and Alan Aja. And then we actually have your talk, Cecilia, on November 2nd on leadership for women of color. And then Professor Cadava mentioned it. Professor Hernandez is upcoming book on racial innocence, and we're going to have a book talk on that on November 16th. And all of these take place at 12 noon Pacific. Of course, we also thank everyone who joined us, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.